We are going to pick up where we left off a year ago with Moses and the Israelites. Anybody remember it? Anybody go back and rewatch all the messages from last year? You will get a prize if you did. All right. So when we left Moses and the Israelites last year, they were standing on the shore of the Red Sea, breathless. They had just come through that Red Sea. They had just seen God do amazing things on their behalf. And they were astounded. A whole year had gone by of one thing after another where God had been working, where they had been slaves and God had been wrestling them free from the hands of Egypt and the Pharaoh. And they had seen God move in moment after moment after moment. And then ultimately, there in that sea, just before this moment where they're standing there, they had walked through that sea like walking on dry ground. And then when Pharaoh's army started chasing them, God took the water he had held back for the Israelites and he slammed it down in judgment, a final act of judgment on Egypt. And so there they learned through all that time that with God, all things are possible. But now standing there on that shore, they used to be slaves. On the other side of that sea where they came from, they were slaves. All their lives they had been slaves. Now here they are free. And standing there crowded along that shore, breathless, amazed, I imagine one of them asked the question that was on everyone's mind. What now? What do we do now? And God had a plan for them. They were supposed to be going home, back to the land where God had given them. And if you look on a map, a quick journey, it would have just taken 2 weeks. They were just about 2 weeks away from being right back where they had been 400 years earlier, in the place where God had for them, the place God had given them. They were just 2 weeks away. Can you imagine that? 2 weeks and we're back in the promised land. 2 weeks and where God wants us to be. That's not what's going to happen, though. Have you ever had something take longer than you thought it would take? Yeah. This message will be one of those things. Israel's about to experience that too. So God didn't take them the short way. God took them through the wilderness. God took them down into the wilderness of Egypt and the Middle East there. And on the way through that wilderness, they came to a point where they decided to quit on God. And then they spent 40 years wandering around in that wilderness. So this is going to take a lot longer than it should have or could have taken. But one of the questions we should ask is why? Why would God take them through the wilderness? And why not just take them straight across? I know it says in Exodus chapter 15, the Philistines lived there and God didn't want the Israelites to experience battle because they would lose heart and change their mind. But we know God could have handled the Philistines too. Why take them this long route through the wilderness? And that question is really important for you and me today because as much as we understand the answer to that question, we'll understand what's going on in our own lives. As much as we can understand why God would take them through the wilderness, we'll understand what's going on in this life we're living in this wilderness that we're in today. You see, the wilderness is a place. It's absolutely a place. There it is on the map. It's still there today. But we should clear this up too. When I say wilderness, you probably think North American wilderness. Trees, forest, cute animals running around, some dangerous animals running around. That's not Middle Eastern wilderness. Middle Eastern wilderness looks like this, where it's barren wasteland. And you cannot, traveling through this place, hot during the day, cold at night, no food, no water, it is not a place that is easy to pass through. And it's an impossible place to live in. You can't live there. So yes, it's a place, but it is more than a place. In the Bible, wilderness is a theme. It's a theme that comes up over and over again, and it represents life outside of God's garden. That's what the wilderness is. Life outside of God's garden. So think back to Adam and Eve, where we first experienced the wilderness. God builds up Adam out of the dust, the wilderness, puts Adam and Eve in the garden where they get to be with God, in God's garden, until they decide to do what? To not trust God, to not obey God. And you can't have life in God's garden. You can't have life eternal without trusting and obeying God. So God sent them out into the wilderness where life would be hard, where work would be frustrating, and relationships would be fractured. Is that what you experience as you live through life? Isn't life hard? Isn't work frustrating? Aren't relationships so often fracturing? We are all of us still living in a wilderness, in this wilderness. And God has a purpose for this wilderness in our lives, just as God had a purpose for the wilderness in the life of Israel. In the words of Tim Mackie from the Bible Project, who, by the way, the Bible Project has a great series called The Wilderness, which covers much more than we're going to cover these next couple months. I encourage you to go listen to that series of podcasts. But Tim Mackie says this. He says, wilderness is simultaneously the worst and best place to be. It's hostile and deadly, yet transformative. It's where self-sufficiency ends and God dependence begins. And the key difference is who you trust in the crisis, in the wilderness. The wilderness is meant to be where we learn to trust and obey God, where our pride and arrogance is broken and we are humbled, appropriately humbled, not shamed, but humbled, and learn to depend on God. This morning, we're going to look at the very first 3 stories of Israel's journey into the wilderness, the very beginning of their journey. And I'm going to show you 2 different ways the wilderness tested them, because these are ways that the wilderness tests you and me today too. And then the third story, they're going to turn the tables and they're going to test God. And we'll see how that goes for them. So go with me to Exodus chapter 15. Again, as always, you can open up our app and follow along and take notes there, or just open your own Bible. Hopefully you've got that with you, or follow on the screen if you don't. But Exodus chapter 15, we're going to start in verse 22. Again, this is right after they've crossed the Red Sea. Moses just sang his beautiful song about everything God had done for them over the previous year to rescue them. And here they are, the edge of the Red Sea, and it says in verse 22, then Moses had Israel set out from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. Anybody gone without water for a few days recently? No, it's imagine you went home and had no water and didn't get it back till Thursday. Imagine that. That would be rough. And they came to Marah, and there was water there, but they couldn't drink the water of Marah because it was bitter. It would make them sick. And therefore it was named Marah, which means bitter. So can you just imagine with me what this would be like? They got out of Egypt. No more slaves, now free. We're going to the land God has for us. They travel 3 days in the wilderness. Slowly their water bladders are depleting and they have no more water now. And there's no sight of water. This is barren wasteland. There's no water. There's no food. What's going to happen to us? Like, how would you feel? You and I would be upset. You and I would be struggling the same way they struggle. How disappointing then. On top of that, to add insult to injury, we found water. Oh no, we can't drink this water. Like, this is just cruel. The wilderness can be cruel. And so the people, it says in verse 24, they grumbled at Moses. What are we supposed to drink? The sand? Grumble here means more than whining and complaining. Grumbling means hostility and anger. They grow hostile and angry toward Moses, the same way you and I would in that situation. Well, think about the last time you got upset. This week, when did you get upset? Think about what it was that upset you. One of the things that bothered you this week when you started to grumble and complain, and maybe you got hostile, maybe you got angry, maybe it was some lack that you had this week, because this is the test of lack here. They lack water. What did you lack this week? Energy to shovel? Help to shovel? Enough shovels to shovel? You didn't lack snow, but maybe you lacked warmth. Maybe you lacked enough ice melt to get rid of the ice. Maybe it was more like a relational thing. Maybe you lacked consideration. Someone wasn't considerate toward you. Maybe you lacked some resource. You needed? How did you respond? What were your emotions? The wilderness will test you with lack. That's what the wilderness does. And there will be things you and I want and think we need that we will not have. Why is it like this? To teach us to trust in God. They failed, obviously. They grumbled at Moses. And since Moses was only doing what God told him to do, that means they're grumbling at God. They grow hostile toward God. They didn't trust God. How should God respond to this? He just spent a year getting them out of Egypt, rescuing them from slavery. How should God respond to their hostility and lack of trust? Verse 25 says, then Moses cried out to Yahweh, and Yahweh showed him a tree, taught him about a tree, and he threw it into the waters, and the waters became sweet. Not only did they become drinkable, they became sweet. God didn't get angry. God uses the wilderness to teach us about himself and that he is the God who provides for us. And then after doing this, God said, okay, here's going to be the rule, guys. Here's going to be the standard that we're going to go through this journey together with, all right? And then this is what God says in end of verse 25. There he set for them a statute and a judgment, and there God tested them. And he said, if you will earnestly listen to the voice of Yahweh your God and do what is right in his sight and give ear to his commandments and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you which I have put on the Egyptians, for I, Yahweh, am your healer. What's the relationship God wants to have with them and with us? That of our healer. God doesn't want to have the relationship where he constantly has to scold and chasten and punish. God wants to be our healer. He wants to turn the bitter waters sweet. But what does that require of us? Trust and obedience. In the Hebrew, it literally says, listen, listen, shema, shema. You can use that when you're talking to your kids. Don't just listen to me, shema, shema me. They'll love it. It'll become the new 6-7, right? Shema, shema. Imagine if parents started that and the kids took it up. Listen, listen. Don't just hear me at a surface level. Yeah, okay, God, I got it. Don't just hear me because I was in church Sunday and I heard somebody talk a bit about God and it sank in to hear. No. This is listen, listen. Make your life about actively listening to God and what he's doing and what he's commanding you to do, and then putting it into practice, trusting and obeying. Those two words go hand in hand. They're often, we often use the word faith to stand for them. Faith means trusting and obeying God. Listen to God. And he will take care of what you need. And just to underscore that, the next thing that happens is God leads them to an oasis. And verse 27 says, then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 date palms, so date trees. And they camped there beside the waters. Now that's interesting. Why point out the numbers here? Why point out 70 date trees and 12 springs of water? Are your minds racing, trying to figure it out? How many tribes of Israel were there? 12. God provides perfectly exactly what they need. A spring for each tribe. Why 70 date palms? Well, for them, they use the number 70 the way we use the number 10 or 100. It's just like the perfect round number. In their system, 70 was like, it's the perfect amount. Just enough. The wilderness is going to test us and test our trust in God with lack. We will have things that we lack. And we, frankly, live in a world that is banking on us feeling lack and then desperately trying to fill lack. That's what all of marketing and advertising is about. And everything runs on ads and commercials. Have you not noticed? Pinging us with lack. You lack, you lack, you lack. And what do? Do we say, no, I trust in God? Or do we grumble and complain and try and go after the thing we think we lack, that the world tells us we lack? Will you trust and obey God? Or will you take things into your own hands and try and satisfy your own needs? What would it look like if you and I were failing this test today? I think for one, it would look like For example, in moments when you're suffering lack, you might all of a sudden become stingy, unwilling to be generous, unwilling to give to someone who's in need, to give to someone who's hurting, to give at church, to give wherever, to give your time, your energy, your resources. Because look, I got to take care of me and my family. So in times where I feel lack, I pull back. And in times where I feel like I have more, then I'll give some more. By the way, statistically, that just isn't true. Across our country, that isn't true. Those who have more do not typically give more. But the reason we pull back when we lack is because we don't trust God. It's not because we lack. It's because we don't trust God. Who cares if you lack? Lacking doesn't matter. Trusting God is all that matters. Or maybe you go through a season of lack, and so you begin to compromise and do ungodly things. And forgive me if this one hits a little close to home. Maybe you're going through lack, and money's tight, and so you decide to, it's too much to pay for that subscription to that streaming service. I'm going to use my friend's credentials to steal that streaming service for myself. That is stealing, if you know that you're not supposed to be doing that. Now, we can, and some of you right now in your minds are justifying, but they're wealthy and they're big and they've got all this and it works and they're not stopping it, so we should be able to do it. The truth is this: if it's not what is supposed to be done and you're taking, then that's stealing. And God tells us to what? Not to steal, but to trust Him for what we need. So my lack makes me act out in a way that is against God, not obedient to God. Will I trust God for what I need? Or go without this thing I want in order to be obedient to God? Or do I want that thing just that much more than I want God? You think that doesn't impact us at a soul level? That we don't grow callous to it? I know it does. I see it in my own life. I compromise a little here, and I grow hard-hearted, and then before I know it, wow, how did this chasm grow between me and God? I let it slip in a small thing, and then a bigger thing, and then a bigger thing. Or maybe you feel the need for love, and instead of trusting God, we take matters into our own hands, and we align ourselves, connect ourselves with someone who isn't pursuing God because we need to feel loved. Doesn't God want me to have a relationship and be loved? Yes, but God wants you to follow Him and not be in a relationship that's going to pull you away from Him. Or maybe you compromise sexually because you need sexual fulfillment, and that drives you to behaviors and actions that don't honor God and aren't God's way, but you need that sexual fulfillment. And so you go after that instead of obeying God because you want that more than you want God. Or maybe it's just work and you take a job or you behave unethically at work because you need that money, you got to provide, and the only way to do it is you got to lie, you got to cheat, you got to gossip, you got to play the game in order to get more money and keep the job and get promotions so that you have all the things you need. You got to take care of yourself, and that's just the way the world is, and if you think it's not that way, you're just naive and you're going to get walked on. Or I realize that's the way the world is, but that's not what life in God's garden is like. And that's what I live for. I'm going to trust God. I don't care what everyone else does. These are the ways you and I fail. And there are many others, and you can think of them for yourself. Where are you? Where are you tempted to quit trusting and obeying God because of some lack in your life? What lack are you experiencing right now that might be keeping you from trusting God? Well, what should they have done instead of grumbling and complaining? Well, instead of grumbling and complaining and taking matters into your own hands, they should have humbly gone to God in prayer and said, here's what we need. We trust you. And then let Him provide, which He obviously can and does. Grumbling and hostility, do you know what that gets you? Death. When someone in your house is grumbling and complaining, or someone at your job is grumbling and complaining, what does that feel like? Death. It hurts. It's frustrating. It fractures everything. Grumbling and complaining is good for nothing, and yet it comes so naturally to us. It's good for nothing. Trust in God brings life. And so maybe this week, one thing you and I can do this week to help us do better with the test of lack when we face it is reflect on moments at the end of each day. Just sit back, quiet, turn everything off, and just say, okay, God, where was I tempted to grumble and complain today? Where was I tempted to take things into my own hands today? And see each of those moments as that was a test of trust in God. That lack was meant to test my trust in God. And then ask, did I do well? Did I do poorly? How did I respond? And then resolve and pray, okay, Lord, how will I respond to the test of lack that I'll go through tomorrow? Because you might have lack that goes on for a long time. I have certain lacks that I have experienced in my life that have gone on now for the better part of 2 decades. And in that case, God is saying, will you trust me and just deal with it? Will you trust me? And every day I have to get up and say, Lord, I trust you. And some days I don't. And some days I grumble and complain. And I get hostile. But every day I get up again and say, Lord, teach me to trust you in this. Pass the test of lack by turning to God. But lack is not the only thing that tests us. The next test we're about to see, we'll call the test of abundance, which is kind of the opposite. Let me show you what happens next. Chapter 16 of Exodus. The whole Israelite community in verse 1. They set out from Elim and they come to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai. And now it's the 15th day of the 2nd month. So they've been traveling for 2.5 months. They're 2.5 months out of Egypt. And in the desert, the whole community, all of them, hundreds of thousands of Israelites, began to grumble and complain against Moses and Aaron. In verse 3 it says, they said to them, if only we had just died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. We should have let him kill us there. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but now you've brought us out into the desert to starve this entire assembly to death. Talk about revisionist history. Do you remember what life was like for them in Egypt? They leave out the bitter slavery. They leave out the murder of their men. They leave out the murder of their firstborn sons. They leave out a whole lot of things. But the truth was, Egypt was a fertile garden-like existence. There was plenty of food. There was a lot there. It was a beautiful man-made garden. And so here they are longing to go back there. They would rather be slaves in that man-made earthly garden of Egypt than go through this and become free sons and daughters in God's garden. That's how the wilderness can mess with our minds. Let me just take the slavery of the man-made garden here that's comfortable, and I've got my pot of meat, which sounds very good, all day long. Just let me have, like that, we would settle for slavery in that situation. Sure, I'm a slave to sin. I do whatever I have to do to get the pot of meat every day, but I like the pot of meat. We'd settle for that rather than being free sons and daughters in God's garden. The wilderness will twist you up. And so it sounds like a test of lack again. They don't have food now. And they continue to fail because they grumble and complain again. They're still being hostile toward God. But now God's going to respond to them with not just enough, but with abundant provision. God's going to give them more than we need. And this is where the test of abundance comes in the wilderness. So go to verse 4 of chapter 6. And let's just go through what happens here. It says, then the Lord said to Moses, I am going to rain down bread from heaven for you. That sounds good. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. Just for that day. In this way, I will do what? Test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. Every day I'm going to send bread. It'll be there in the morning. You go out, you gather just enough for the day, no more. Will you trust me enough that I'll send it again tomorrow? So this is God setting up the test. He's going to give them more than they need. Will they accept and just take what they need for the day? On the 6th day, God says, they are to prepare what they bring in, and it should be twice as much as they gather on other days, because on Fridays, God says, gather twice as much. I'll make sure it lasts for 2 days, because Saturdays, that is Sabbath day. That is a day I command you to stop and just rest. Just rest. And so there ain't going to be any bread on the ground when you wake up on Saturday mornings. Fridays, you can get double. So that's what God sets up for them. So Moses and Aaron, they say to all the Israelites, in the evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. And in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we that you should grumble against us? Moses said to them. And then he also said, you will know it was the Lord when he gives you meat to eat in the evening and all the bread you could want in the morning, because he heard your grumbling against him. Who are we? You're not grumbling against us, but against the Lord. So then Moses told Aaron, say to the entire Israelite assembly, come before the Lord, for he heard your grumbling. And while Aaron is speaking to the whole community, talking to them, they looked toward the desert, and there was the glory of the Lord coming in a cloud. Now that had to be scary. Let's all get together. Hey, I want you to know God heard you complaining about him. Oh, here he comes now. Yikes. This dark cloud begins to move toward them. And then verse 13, that evening, quail came. That's what the dark cloud was. It covered the camp. Quail is a type of bird, in case anyone didn't know. And that was all the meat they needed. And then in the morning, they woke up, and there was a layer of dew around the camp. And when the dew evaporated, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. And when the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, what is this? For they didn't know what it was. And Moses said to them, it's the bread the Lord has given you to eat. And this is what the Lord has commanded. Everyone should gather as much as they need for today. Take an omer for each person you have in your tent. Just enough for each person. But there's so much of it. Take just enough for today for each person. And the Israelites did as they were told. Some gathered much, some gathered little, depending on their family size. And when they measured by the omer, the one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. Everyone had gathered just as much as they needed. And then Moses said to them, no one should keep any for tomorrow. Don't keep any until the morning. Guess what they did? A whole bunch of them tried to get as much as they possibly could fit into their tents and store it, because we don't know if God's going to send us bread tomorrow. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We got abundance. We're going to grab it all and hoard as much as we can, like it's toilet paper in 2020. We are going to get all that we can get and hoard this and stock it up, because we got to take care of ourselves. So they tried. A bunch of them tried. Did my battery just die? He says he's on. You can hear me. People on the live stream can't. Let me do this. I'll go purple, Mike. See if I can talk and hold a mic at the same time. So, they gather up, a whole bunch of them gather up more than they should have gathered up. Tried to save for the next day. And when they wake up the next day, it is rotten and full of maggots. God was doing what? Was testing them with abundance. I've given you more than you could possibly need, but I'm telling you, only take the bread you need for today. Will you trust me? And many, many, many of them didn't. They failed the test of abundance by not trusting God, not obeying God, and instead trying to hoard their abundance, thinking it's they had to do for themselves. And so God had brought them into the wilderness to teach them a lesson. Peace of mind does not come from abundance. It comes from having God. Peace of mind doesn't come from having enough bread for tomorrow and the next day and the next day, however much you got in your freezer. Peace of mind comes from having God. The wilderness is meant to teach us that. That's where peace of mind comes from. But it's also meant to humble us with another profound lesson. Whatever you have is not the result of your work, but of God's grace. What do you mean? We worked. We picked up the manna. We got it with our own two hands. We stored it up. That was our manna. God shouldn't have made it go bad like that. Jesus warned us very clearly, don't store up treasures in this world because rust gets it, moths get it, and they eat it and they corrupt it. Store up treasures in heaven. Store up the righteousness of God. That never spoils. That never goes bad. That never grows old. So who put the manna on the ground for you to pick up? You think you made this happen? Who gave you the breath you're breathing that enables you to work and produce? Who made the world so that food could grow in it? Of course we all work. Many of us work really hard. But no matter what we do, we'll never be independent of God. And that is a lesson the wilderness is meant to teach us. The original sin of Adam and Eve, we can be independent from God. We don't have to trust God. We can trust ourselves. The wilderness is meant to teach us. That is a lie. That is not true. We will always depend on God. There is no way to not depend on God. We must depend on Him. And so the test of abundance is meant to reveal our trust in God.
or our lack of trust in God? Will we hoard the abundance? Will we allow abundance to trick us into thinking that we did this, we made this happen? Or will we see it as this is all what God's allowed me to have and it's all for him and what he wants to do with it? I trust and obey God. How does abundance tempt you to not trust God or to disobey God? I invite you to think about, where are you experiencing abundance in your life right now? Are you trusting God with it? Are you constantly thankful to God for it? Are you using it in godly ways? Or are you under the delusion that you did this and now it's yours to do with whatever you like? That is a lie, and it is not true. Whatever you have is a result of what God has allowed you to have. This week, I invite you to identify one area where you're experiencing abundance, and then choose to do something that'll help you remember that it wasn't about you, it's about God. And that you don't rely on that abundance to make you secure. You rely on God. Maybe that means giving away some or all of that abundance you have. Maybe it means being more intentional about celebrating Sabbath day, where you say, I will not work because my life does not depend on my work. My family's life does not depend on my work. It depends on God's grace and his provision. So I will stop and enjoy God's creation and rest for a day because God set me that example and gave me that command. The wilderness is meant to teach us to trust and obey God. And in the wilderness, we learn that God is all we have and God is all we need. The Patriots, who thank God are in the Super Bowl. Everybody's happy about that? Yeah. Good. I'm luring you in. Good job. They've got a motto going, which has been around for a while. Does anybody know what it is? We all we got, we all we need. It's on T-shirts. It's painted on the bus. They might have painted it on the plane by now. I don't know, but it's the motto that they're going by. We all we got, we all we need. Can I just tell you that? Okay, fine for a sports team. I get it, but that's a motto that many people try to live by, and it is a lie. It is a lie, and it's not true. It actually tempts that original sin in us that wants to think that, yeah, I'm all I've got, I'm all I need. We have this drive to be self-sufficient, to not depend on other people. And that is a temptation of this wilderness we live in. To think that, oh, my abundance is what I did. The truth is, and what the wilderness is meant to teach us, is that God is all you have. Because the wilderness, you will face lack, and then sometimes you'll face abundance, but it can be gone in a heartbeat. It's not about what you've done or what you have. You completely depend on God, always. And the quicker you and I learn that, the better. Because the quicker you and I learn that, the less likely we'll be to be tempted to chase after these other gardens, these man-made gardens that want to really just make us slaves. Because every man-made garden has turned some group of people into slaves. The quicker you and I learn that everything I have is from God and I lean and trust on him, the quicker we can escape the temptation to go after that stuff and to just live for him and trust and obedience. So those are the two tests God gives them through the wilderness. But remember I said they turn around and they tested God. So let's just quickly touch on this third test in chapter 17. And let's see how this goes. 17 verse 1, this is going to sound familiar. We're back to having water problems. The whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So what did they do? They quarreled, they grumbled with Moses, and they said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses replied, "Why are you quarreling with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?" But the people were thirsty for water, and they grumbled against Moses. And they said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst? You just did this because you wanted to kill us in the wilderness, God." Again, they're going after God, not Moses. And God understands that to be the case. They're putting God to the test. They're accusing God of having bad motives toward them. You just did all this just to bring us here and kill us. They're accusing God of being evil. They're putting God on the test here. And then verse 4, Moses cries out to the Lord, "God, what am I supposed to do with these people? They're ready to stone me." And the Lord answers Moses. This is amazing. He says, "Go out in front of the people and take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. Remember the staff that God gave Moses? It was the staff God used to judge Egypt. So that staff was how Moses did all the plagues and everything, including, in particular, he mentions here, the river Nile. Remember when Moses struck the river Nile with the staff, it turned blood red and undrinkable and toxic. That water, that river of life for Egypt, where everything was built around that river, it became a river of death because God pronounced judgment through that rod. Now God tells Moses, take that rod. We're heading out here to this rock. I'm going to show you. What is God going to have Moses do with this rod of judgment? Verse 6. God says, I will stand before you on the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock. Where God's standing. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink. So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel, and they called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled and because they tested the Lord, saying, is God with us or not? Can we trust God or not? But do you see what God did there? Because it's truly amazing. After all God had done for them, they're accusing him of having bad intentions toward them. They're accusing him of not really being with them and not caring for them, of being untrustworthy. And because they're thirsty and desperate for water, their situation is desperate, just desperate enough to make them doubt God, who has done all these amazing things. What does it take to get you there? How much would it take to get you to the place where you're questioning God? Days without water. They're wrestling, they're struggling. But what God does here is just, it blows my mind. God stands at this rock and tells Moses, take that staff of judgment and strike the rock where I stand. God is putting himself in the place of being judged. He is putting himself on the rock and saying, strike me with judgment. I will stand trial. You strike me with that staff of judgment, and let's see what the verdict will be. And what happened when God was struck with that rod? Life flowed out of him onto them. Water flowed out of that rock, and their thirst for life was quenched. It drives me crazy when I hear people say that the God of the Old Testament is angry and mean and bitter, and the God of the New Testament is nice and gracious. And they miss how gracious and patient God is here with Israel. Look at God dealing with their hostility with grace. Look at God when they should be the ones being judged. God stands on the rock and says, strike me with the judgment and see if blessing doesn't flow out of me. God's love has always been a sacrificial love. The same sacrificial love we see in Jesus, we see in God throughout time because God never changes. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. The Apostle Paul picked up on this, by the way, in the New Testament. In 1 Corinthians 10, he says, I don't want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud, that was God's presence, and that they all passed through the sea. He's talking about this moment with Moses and Israel. They all ate the same spiritual food, the manna sent from heaven, and they drank the same spiritual drink, the water from the rock. For they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. God is the same, yesterday, today, forever. When we deserve judgment and death, he sacrifices himself to give us life. Team, would you make your way back? When Jesus went into the wilderness, I don't know how many of you remember, when Jesus went in 40 days, he fasted, no food, wandering in the wilderness there, being tempted by the enemy, going through all the tests of the wilderness that we go through. He was tempted to, hey, why don't you make yourself some bread, Jesus? And what did Jesus say? I don't live by bread alone. Sure, I need bread, but what I live by is the words that come out of God's mouth. I live by God. Then Jesus was tempted to settle for the abundance of a man-made garden. Look, Jesus, I'll give you all the treasures of the world. All you have to do is bow to me. Just bow to me, Jesus. Accept the goodness I have to offer you. Just look how amazing the goodness of the world can be, all these gardens. But Jesus instead insisted on worshiping God and God alone. and not bowing the knee to anyone else. Then Jesus was tempted to test whether or not the Father would protect him and be with him, to put God to the test by throwing himself off a high place. And Jesus refused to put God to the test. Jesus passed all the tests of the wilderness and then climbed up on the cross to be struck with judgment, the judgment you and I deserve. And what flows out of Jesus is what has always flowed out of Jesus. It's life. And that's why we sing songs like we're about to sing. Jesus paid it all. All to him we owe. Sin has left a crimson stain, and he washes us white as snow. Jesus stepped in and took that judgment for you and me in the face of our hostility and our grumbling. So let's just take a moment. We're going to sing this song. I invite you to stand with me as we do, and then we'll celebrate communion together. If anyone still didn't get a packet, they're in the back. Go grab it while we're singing this song. But let's worship him for who he is and what he's done.